All right, Paul VanderKlay, I am really excited to be chatting with you today.
As am I. I'm looking forward to this. Sorry to
Likewise.
hijack your iceberg video. I like the video, but when I find stuff on the internet, I talk about it.
No, not at all. It's always good to see people kind of continuing the conversation on things. And for people that didn't get that reference, I made a video, I guess maybe a month or so ago now, about the iceberg of traditional Christianity. And you made a video kind of responding to it, engaging with it. And I think you brought up some really good points about it. And I'm sure we can get into that a little. One of the things that I said in that video was just kind of talking about the strange corner of the internet that I inhabit. And I think we're neighbors in that corner of the internet, or at least in neighboring zip codes. I'd be curious, I take it you've been making videos for a little bit. Well, first, how long have you been making videos?
I've the my first well, shoot. I've been making videos for a while, but a lot of the videos nobody saw because they're the Freddie and Paul show. Uh,
Okay.
I so I blogged for a long time, and then there was a member of my church who, a long story, came up to me one day and said, "Pastor Paul, why don't you and I make a TV show?" And he was going down to public access TV, and that didn't really work with my schedule. So I said, "Hey, Freddie, why don't I just take out my smartphone? We'll make a little video, and I'll put it on YouTube, and you can watch it and share it with your mom and do whatever." So we did that for a few years, and then Jordan Peterson came along, and I was interested in what was going on around Peterson, and I wasn't finding as much interest with my clergy colleagues. I'm a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. I pastor a church in Sacramento, California. So I decided I would make a video because why not? And the video was something like 3 reasons why this pastor thinks Jordan Peterson is important. And I expected to get 10 or 15 views, and I got like a few hundred the first day, and that kept creeping up. And then people kept subscribing to the channel, and I started getting emails and requests for conversations, and that was all very strange. I wasn't prepared. I didn't understand that YouTube was a social media network. I thought it was just a place you could post videos, and so Freddie could see a stock. So that started a thing, and that thing has kept going now for 7 years. So my first video I posted in November of 2017 about Jordan Peterson, and then a lot of people started contacting me and wanting to just talk. And because I'm a pastor, that's what I do. I talk. So I was talking to a lot of people offline, both locally and on Skype and on Zoom. And then the conversations, I started a meetup. This conversation started getting repetitive. So I began asking permission if I could share some of the conversations that were appropriate on my channel. And when I did that, that really got things going. And then for a while, I was having 10 or 15 of these conversations a week, and my regular job couldn't sustain that level. So I had to pare that back. But then people that I was talking to started talking to each other. And then my local meetup guys that were made up mostly not of people of my church, we started a Discord server, and that pretty quickly grew to 3,000 people had subscribed to it. And the channel just kept growing. So I've just kept doing this, and what has developed is a couple of things. When Jordan Peterson got sick and sort of disappeared, I pivoted. I was starting a network of Jordan Peterson meetups, and I pivoted them to what I call estuary groups, which are sort of church adjacent open conversation groups. And so my friend John Vidonk and I sort of developed this thing, and we've been sort of spreading those groups all around the world since then. And we have a training program for those groups, and we have put those groups into a network. And then as I no longer had quite as much time and attention to do the randos conversations with just one-off conversations with people, and as sort of the Jordan Peterson phenomena began to subside, more and more of the people who I talked to started their own channels. And then we started having conversations on live streams on the channels. And that has continued. So we've got a network of probably, I don't know, maybe 100 estuary groups around the world that are going. And then we have these live streams. I also started way back when, having conversations with Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke. Jonathan Pageau, very quickly when I started talking about Jordan Peterson, we got in contact and we started a friendship. And same with John Vervaeke, someone talked about him. And so Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke and I have been doing events just every now and then, every year or two, we'll do an event together. And so now we're starting these other estuary events in different places around the world too. So this thing has just kind of kept growing. And so one of the monikers that developed about the online space, so the in real life space is called estuary, but the online space, people just refer to it as sort of this little corner. So then when you said corner, sort of triggered a bunch of my people to, he's talking about the corner. And
That's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah. So then I've also developed I developed a dislike to what I called Christian YouTube, which was a style of YouTubing on Christianity that tends to forefront inter-tradition wars. We got the Protestants against the Catholics and the Orthodox, and all of these channels are sort of concern trolling where, or boundary policing all the time. And I just find that distasteful, even though I have boundaries. I'm a confessional, I belong to a confessional denomination. But I find that people just need a space to talk. And I found actually your channel is much more like the kind of online community that we have. I don't see you doing a lot of boundary policing or concern trolling. You seem to much more just talk about things that you find and you wonder about it and you have an openness to you. So, but then I saw your Iceberg video and that caught my attention. So I always with a little fear and trembling pick on someone that I don't know and, hope they don't complain to YouTube or anything like that. But most of the time it works out okay.
No, yeah. I mean, I think, well, first, thanks. I'm glad that you have found the channel to generally be kind of open and curious. I mean, that's what I aim for. And I think the Iceberg video was probably a little bit of a departure from my usual videos in that it got into some things that I see as, I don't even know if concerning is the right word. It probably is. Some trends in the online space specifically, more than the in real life space, of this kind of slide that people make as they get into various forms of traditional Christianity, whatever they might be. But something you brought up in your response video, which I think was really pertinent, was kind of the way that I formed the Iceberg, right? And putting certain social issues together towards the bottom of it, which wasn't some function just like of what fit. Initially, I was trying to do 2 things per row, and I'm just inept at making memes, so I could only fit 1 at a time. But I think it's you brought up some really interesting points about how we've gotten, how I don't want to butcher how you put it, like a post-war orthodoxy of kind of our social norms, if you will, like how we view something like any number of things, the Holocaust, women's rights. I think I talked about, what did I say? Holocaust denial, and it was like women shouldn't vote, no one should vote, monarchy, theocracy. Just kind of like a fun little development that people do. But I think you rightly pointed out, like, it's interesting that we went from all these theological issues to the social ones. And so something I'd just be kind of curious about generally, we can get into those specifically, but I think generally speaking, like, are there things that you look out on in this corner of the internet? Not the specific, not capital T, capital C, the corner, but in the kind of online Christian space. You mentioned kind of concern trolling and boundary policing. Of this kind of, like, at least as I look out, there seems to be a real upswing in interest in Orthodoxy, Catholicism. Just you've got Redeemed Zoomer doing a lot of like the Reconquista of kind of, more traditional forms of whatever this is. Is there anything that you look out and think, oh, this is either strange, that like certain streams that are going on in this, or anything that concerns you in any ways?
I've got lots of concerns. I think nobody makes videos unless they have some concerns. And of
Fair.
course, the internet is for complaint. It's think of people's favorite pastime, expressing their anxieties or complaining at the internet. And part of the reason those things caught my interest is because not too long before that, in my most recent conversation with Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke, I'm always sort of working on as a pastor, what makes up the implicit religion that most of us share? Now, we don't call these things religions. Because of modernity, we say, well, there's Judaism and Christianity and Islam, but those are religions. But I would say that people's real religion tends to be what they care about, how they frame their universe, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that John Vervaeke had been pushing for is he sort of pivoted from the religion that's not a religion into the philosophical Silk Road. And he's been talking about the advent of the sacred. I wanted to engage him on that. And I brought Pageau in because the three of us, again, we do these conversations semi-regularly. And Jonathan Pageau made an excellent point when he talked about how the two events in the Second World War, the Holocaust and Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the dropping of the atomic bomb, these sort of became sacred. These are sort of the sacred elements of our contemporary Western religion. They tend to be the predominant concerns we see the world through. For example, with Ukraine war, that people are killing each other and slaughtering each other. That's, they're doing that. But is there going to be nuclear escalation? That's our concern. Questions about Israel and Palestine and the rise of anti-Semitism in the West. And so these things tend to frame not necessarily what modernity sort of pushes to the side as sacred things in religion that normal people don't have to bother with, but somehow racism, found in anti-Semitism or other forms of racism, or the threat of nuclear war, these are the things we really hold sacred. Because if you want to, Tom Holland has made the point that Nazis have basically replaced Satan in our religious cosmology. And nuclear destruction has basically replaced hell. Or now maybe environmental collapse and global warming is sort of a replacement of hell. So these are things that as a culture, and I picked up this book because one of the videos, I make only about a tenth of the videos I want to make, but like Stories of Old is a good YouTube channel. You're probably aware of it. He does movie type reviews, and he did a great video on nuclear war. And he talked about this book, which I picked up but haven't had a chance to read yet, which basically makes the argument that the real religion of the late 20th century, and I guess probably the early 21st century now, is how the threat of nuclear war shapes our world. And again, I think someone could make the argument that in the last 20, 30 years, the threat of environmental collapse, birth rates are reduced because people your age say to me things like, I don't want to bring a child into this world. That's something I heard during the Cold War. So even though people might be ostensibly nuns or Christian of some variety or Jewish or some variety or in the West Muslim or Buddhist or what have you, yeah, these religions to one degree or another do shape people. But I often suspect, and I see this as a pastor too, there are deeper religions that we share. And those religions, I sort of riff on Tom Holland, who, you go back a few years, you can find a great video of his where he basically asks, was the ancient world religious? Because if one of us were to time travel, go to ancient Greece or Rome, we'd see the temples, we'd see the sacrifices, we'd see all of this stuff. And to them, they look completely religious, but they were just, Agamemnon's just trying to get his ships to Troy so he can, beat the crap out of them, ostensibly over Helen. But is that religion? No, that's the way the world works. And the secular age sort of it told us, okay, we're going to park religion to the side and make that sort of a lifestyle choice. But the real stuff is, and that's where we get into, say, reductive materialism, scientism, and all the anxieties that we have in our world. And so those are the functional religions that actually transcend a lot of the little religious silos that we have. And so those are a lot of the things I'm concerned about and interested in, and I'm always kind of probing at.
Interesting. So it sounds like there's this gap between kind of what we might profess as our religion and the seems like values in religion are pretty similar, and at least the way you're using that in some cases there, of like the implicit assumptions, the things we value most that are maybe directing our actions, or at least coloring the way in which we see the world, what we say is good and what we say is bad, and what we say is, yeah, like, oh, that's scary, stay away from that kind of thing. Is that fair?
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you call Paul Kingsnorth's Erasmus lecture on first things.
No,
So
I
I'm going to
didn't.
be talking to Paul and Martin Shore over in Ireland next month. And so I'm going back and forth with Paul about this lecture, because this lecture sort of grabbed a certain part of the internet. And, you know, when you ask him, he'll say, I'm just trying to figure out how I should live.
Mm-hmm.
And there, in the sense, that's the religious bedrock. How should you live? Of course, Francis Schaeffer riffed on that a generation ago. But what is truly good and beautiful? What do you aspire to? What are the rungs of the ladder that you work in order to reach there? And so if you're St. Anthony out in the desert, it's different than if you're Britney Spears or Taylor Swift or Donald Trump. They all have hierarchies, and they all have ideals, and they're trying to reach them. And I would argue that actually is our functional religions. And as a culture, despite the little religious silos in churches or synagogues or temples or mosques people go to, it's probably these fundamental ones that shape the decisions we actually make in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's largely right. I haven't often used the word religion to describe these things, though. I mean, I could see how you certainly could. Religion is kind of a slippery word to define, and I think we can use it in different ways. But I've often talked about like our functional worldview and our creedal worldview. So you might have a stated worldview, like if I asked you, what is the good life, or what is the what does human flourishing look like, or what's the point of all of this, or any number of those kind of big questions. I think most people watching this and most people in general, probably have some like creedal, or even if it's not formed in a creed, like the thing that they would profess or confess, like, yes, this is the right answer to that. If this was a test, they could fill it out. But I think we can probably reverse engineer what people actually believe. And I know that might sound presumptuous, but if we take that our actions kind of stem from our beliefs, we could probably come up with a oftentimes very different functional worldview. So I could say, like, yeah, the good life is to know God and to love our neighbors, and I could say that's the good life. But if you looked at my life, and I spent all my time, my money, my energy, my fears were wrapped up in say material possession, you might think like it's a really funny way of showing what you believe. It might actually indicate that you believe something altogether different.
No, I think that's right. And again, as a preacher, I mean, part of what you're trying to do is you take the Bible and your Christian tradition and you lean into the people and you say, okay, this is what you say you believe, but these are the things you do. So let's see if we can bring the behaviors a little bit more in accordance with the professions. But a lot of Christian profession can be pretty slippery. Okay, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Okay, well, what does that look like? Does that look like being a monk? Does that look like being a minister? How does that affect if you are a, whatever, fill in the blank, depending on whatever you are. And so again, preachers are always working on this. And, part of what we're looking at, and then part of what I've, long noticed is that, okay, so you've got these people over here, they're in the church, and you've got these people over there, they're outside the church. How different are their lives? And that, again, that's a pretty slippery question too, because just looking from the outside, their lives might look a lot alike. You sit down with them and talk. Ideally, let's say the Christian should be living at peace and hope, and the other person is maybe full of anxiety and desperation. And there have been a variety of studies that have worked on this. George Barna, again, a number of years ago, wrote a very interesting book. What was the name of that book? Something like The Saints Among Us. And he did some pretty in-depth surveying, and he showed that actually there's a small percentage of the population that outgives, outserves, outperforms, and that this, in fact, is tied to religious observance. Now, someone might be happy to say, so I'm a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. Oh, these are all Christian Reformed people. No, that's not how it works. Someone say, they're all Christian people. It's like, well, in our population, that tends to be the case, but there's a lot of Christians in our population. So some of those are Jews. Some of those might be Muslims. Some of those might be nuns or atheists. So very quickly being to wind down, okay, so then what exactly is the genuine article that we are pursuing? And so does your creedal life is that actually of value? And so for a couple centuries now, with really the advent of broad public secularism, people have sort of been looking with skepticism at Christian structures and saying, well, maybe we can get rid of all of the beliefs that I don't know if I embrace, like the virgin birth or the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. And maybe we can just sort of popularize whatever it is that makes those people nice and sacrificial and benevolent and all of those things that we think are sort of self-evident values that we want to promote, even though, again, if you read someone like Tom Holland, he'll say, that's just all Christian legacy. These ideals, the ideals of Sam Harris, Jesus basically smuggled in and gave him his values and said, like some leper, don't tell anyone I was here, and, sneaks out. So, and that then begins to, in an age when lots of people are dropping out of organized religion or church or leaving, let's say, the religious tradition that they were raised in, okay, well, what do we do then? And we're also living in an age when a lot of people thought, well, we'll just start secular churches. That's been started for 200-300 years, and the project has always failed. And so the truth is, I think we have no idea what we're doing.
Yeah, it does seem that we don't entirely know what we're doing. And it seems to be that that's part of the conversation going on in, I'll call this an adjacent zip code to where I operate on the internet, which is kind of this movement of, I don't know what to call them, but I think there's a lot of kind of like disaffected new atheists, like kind of post-new atheists who feel like we tore something down and maybe we haven't replaced it with something better. And, well, I'm not really sure what would be better. It's fascinating. I was listening to one talk about like, he was on a show and they was asked like, so what are you going to do with your kids? Like, if you think religion's like more or less good, but you just don't believe in it, like, you're going to tell them like they should do it anyway because it's probably good for them and it'd be better for society if we all did it, even though we don't think it's true or something. It's really interesting to see people work through these questions because it does seem that there's this sense of maybe we threw out the baby with the bathwater, or as I think it was Alex O'Connor put on a podcast the other day, we threw out the baby with the holy water.
Well, and I, looking at someone like, so there's a lot of utilitrads floating around now, high status utilitrads.
Oh, I like this term. Yeah.
Like, it's not original to me. Pastors are thieves. I look around for language and I pick people's pockets. So, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, at least initially, was sort of labeled that way, or you're only Christian because of the civilizational payout and dig into her story. No, there's a personal payout that has led her down this road. But as you said, a lot of people want to say, maybe new atheism was sort of like AIDS and it wiped out this religious thing that we had, and that religious thing actually made people more generous, or at least put within the culture a value of generosity. And, I look back on the first few years on YouTube, and a lot of those early conversations, they're all still on my channel. They were mostly with young men who basically were suffering from nihilism-induced depression. And so in listening to Jordan Peterson, he gave them enough to sort of crawl out of nihilism, and some of them crawled into church and found that just life is a lot better. And they still have lots of questions. They still, that virgin birth, again, because they grew up in a secular materialist context, they've got, that supernatural barrier is really tough for them. But others have other barriers. And I think as a civilization, we haven't quite figured out what to do, because pretty much every long-standing civilization has had at its core a religious system, because that system that system provides the ideals, and that system provides the ladders. And if you don't have those, then suddenly you just have unending competition between different systems. And the United States was different in that, unlike the European nations that many of its people came out of, and even some of the other nations around the world, the United States didn't have a state church. But what we really had was kind of a conglomeration of Protestant churches. So that was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. No Jews, no Catholics, no blacks, no African Americans, no Hispanics, just the waspy guys. They sort of sat like lions on top of the culture and told everyone how to behave. And that begins to break down during the FDR's administration, when he starts bringing Catholics and Jews in. And so then into the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you sort of have Protestant, Catholic, Jew. But then the counterculture arrives, and now suddenly we're dealing with Sufism and Buddhism and Hinduism. And then, of course, the immigrant patterns begin to change in the United States. And then, and since then, we've really had, okay, diversity is our goal. Okay. Diversity, how? So is your Islamic neighbor from a very, from Pakistan really allowed to keep his wife locked in the house against her will in America? That's diversity in some groups. And we'd say, no, you can't treat a woman that way. His daughters need to be educated and have the right to dress how they want to. But at the same time, the religion has a right to maintain its own community and have its own religious values. And so, all of these little conflicts have been eating at so many of the implicit assumptions. And because you don't have a state church, there's really no way to negotiate these conflicts of values. And so what has tended to happen is it tends to get kicked into the political realm. And, that's sort of really what we're seeing today. And now with Trump, to a degree, people want, okay, well, let's maybe take a step. And Donald Trump is the strangest man to enforce traditional Christian values. But, Aaron Renn has said he's sort of the first post-Christian president we've had, in that when Ronald Reagan ran for president, people were like, are we really going to elect a president who's been divorced? And we elected lots of presidents who cheated on their wives, but that was all over to the side. And so, but now, nobody said, it wasn't at the top of the salience hierarchy for Donald Trump, his divorces. He gave us lots more to talk about. So, and so then you have these conversations about Christian nationalism. And so we as a culture, ostensibly as, an imperial power in the world, how do we navigate without a religious core? And if we sort of have this implicit religious core, that sort of is the inheritance from kind of, Northern European Protestantism, who does the negotiation And how do those negotiations get maintained? At least England has a king who's ostensibly part of the Church of England, even though Charles has a history of sort of a soft perennialism. So how do we do this? And that's sort of where we're at.
Yeah, how do we do it? Is this where I went wrong? Is theocracy the answer?
Well, there's a whole lot of Americans who are going to have a problem with it.
I do think so.
Because, secularism has disrupted the priestly and prophetic class that's going to say, "Thus says the Lord, O King Ahab, you cannot have Naboth's vineyard." So in a context where, even though a majority of Americans for a very long time have said there is a God, they're by no means on the same page in terms of how that God speaks and who that God speaks through. But this dilemma goes all the way to Constantine. So, Constantine thought, we have way too many gods. You can read Augustine's City of God. We have all these gods for the hinges, gods for the doorknob, gods for the door frame, so Constantine wanted one God to rule them all. And hey, look, you've got a monotheism that's sort of growing in the empire. They've already got a priestly class. They're generous to the poor. They like social order. They seem to be growing well. They've got a religious story that's really doing well. Let's go with them. And then very quickly, he has to sit in the middle of a council that says, Jesus is God or Jesus is something else. How do we fix that? And so again, we've been playing this game for a very long time. And what we do in democracy is basically vote on it through proxy. So should abortion be decided at the federal level? No, let's kick it down to the states. Get that off our agenda. But even in denominations, my denomination just went through a very big fight over same-sex marriage and human sexuality. And one side says, you're not believing the clear word of God. And the other side saying, the clear word of God says, love your neighbor. How can you be so horrible to gay and lesbian people by not, opening marriage to them and having the church bless that? So, and of course, this isn't anything new.
No, it's not. I'm very curious, as we look at kind of what's going on, you mentioned the idea of kind of post-Christian, Trump being our first kind of post-Christian president, and we talked about the kind of hole perhaps left by increasing secularization, right? The new atheists, like, we've gotten rid of something, but what fills this void? I'm very curious, and I don't know, I'm genuinely curious. I suppose none of us truly know what Christianity is going to fill that void. Like what Christianity is rising from the ashes of post-Christendom. Because on the one hand, when I see kind of these intellectual figures who are maybe philosophically and politically inclined saying, we've lost the religion that binds us together, and so we need something that kind of is going to work. On the one hand, what you would, at least in some cases, suspect is it would be a rather kind of amorphous, maybe even kind of like progressive Christianity that doesn't make a lot of claims, because the claims is what we were reacting to, right? Like that's what we were getting rid of, all the supernatural stuff. Like that wasn't working for us, so we got rid of it. But maybe we can have this like watered down Christianity. And it's possible that that's one scenario goes down. But interestingly, it doesn't seem like that's what a lot of people are being attracted to, even who are coming out of that. It's right. More of this, like, as you said, like a utilitarian approach to religion, and seeing like traditional Christianity almost as both an individual, like self-help program, from making my bed to praying the rosary kind of thing, as like that is my road out of nihilism. But also as kind of a cultural remedy of, hey, you know what? We need a Christianity with some muscle behind it. And so we're just going to go as far into it as we can. Even if we're not like fully sure we believe these things on an intellectual level, we're just going to adopt it all. I don't know how long something like that lasts. Maybe it does have staying power. It seems But it seems like at least these are two ways it could go. Then we also have I'll add one more stream, and then I'd love to get your thoughts on what you see coming next, is maybe less so in America, but certainly in like the global South and other parts of the world, we're seeing a very like experientially oriented Christianity, which I guess we have in like the non-denominational seeker-sensitive movement, but even like a heightened experientialism of direct experience of God, something like Pentecostalism. So there's a lot of things that are on offer for filling this void in a Christian way. There's other things as well. But do you have any sense of what you see happening now and happening into the future?
Well, the first thing to say is the United States is a very big country, and the West is even bigger. So it's very difficult for any of us to see everything or even a lot. But lately I've been throwing around the word metagelical. If you look at, let's say, the religious history of the United States, you got a bunch of deists. You've got a bunch of people who fled the old world because they're religious extremists. You got the Pilgrims, you got the Puritans, you've got the Quakers, you've got Anglicans of various sort, nonconformists, Baptists, and of course, then you're going to have this big wave of Methodism that comes through after, the American Civil War sort of scorches the South in terms of their religious institutions too. And the North basically reseeds the South with a bunch of Northern institutions. That holds together until sort of the modernist fundamentalist, and that begins sort of the breakup. After the Second World War, you have the rise of the neo-evangelicals, because what's happening, Protestant Catholic Jew in the Roosevelt administration doesn't really hold together. It gives room to the Catholics. It leaves space for the Jews, but the Jews remain a small but very powerful group in America. And then, of course, the counterculture comes in and sort of fragments really what begins to do in the Mainline is the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement basically says to the Mainline, it was on your watch that the nation systematically subjected former slaves 100 years in to legalized segregation, repression, and brutality. And in many ways, the Mainline tried to take that into themselves, but and that sort of set up even what we see sort of in the Mainline now, where all they're ever doing is apologizing for their power. And okay, confession is good for the soul, but it's really difficult to establish a confident culture upon us. So then what grows in the post-World War II era is neo-evangelicalism, which is a confident, modernist, fairly dualist, has a lot of those roots from fundamentalism, but the edges are sort of shaved off. And evangelicalism starts, vacuuming in people from the Mainline. There's a countercultural version that starts with the Jesus people, but they're very evangelical. Pentecostalism starts coming in, they get enfolded. And so by the 1980s, evangelicalism is sort of this big Jesus tent. And they're not confessionalists. They've got on different sides of all sorts of issues, but kind of the main civilizational religion is Protestant evangelicalism. And then, of course, they, George W. Bush is really the first completely evangelical president, because his conversion went back to Billy Graham. He had trouble with drinking. He was a party guy, yada, yada, yada. His father was Episcopalian. You had someone like Charles Colson from the Watergate, becomes born again. Jimmy Carter is the first born again president. So you have this evangelicalism that sort of moves into the culture. And I think a lot of what has happened since then is a lot of those themes have continued to move. New atheism, really hits a lot of things hard. But evangelicalism is sort of still in the game, hasn't been eaten away as much as, let's say, the Mainline or even Catholic nominalism or some of those. And what we're seeing now is, I think, the integration of conservative Catholics. Of course, abortion helped cement the coalition between evangelicals and Catholics in the right to life fights, and now the Orthodox coming in. And so there's a desire for rigor. There's a desire to be different from the rest. And so I think, lately I've been doing videos on the emergent movement. The emergent church movement really goes from about 1995 to 2015. Mark Driscoll for a little while. But the emergent movement splits up into sort of those who eventually assimilated with the Mainline, the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement that is now sort of infiltrating denominations like my own, like the Christian Reformed Church, very strong in the PCA, the Acts 29 network, a lot of Reformed Baptists. But then a lot of the people who sort of wouldn't go mainline, and went Young, Restless, and Reformed for a little while, but that didn't really suit them. A lot of them are now going Orthodox and Trad Catholic and Anglican because they're looking for a really sacramental, crunchy religion, and they're looking for a religion with rigor. And it's not a bug that an Orthodox clergy will wear that black robe or have the long beard and have the icons and do things different. And that's a feature because they're getting at this anxiety that we started talking about, that okay, the Christians look just like the non-Christians and the nuns, and these people stopped going to church, but they're still nice people and they still care for their neighbor and they still try to be nice. But what is the Christianity worth if it doesn't, pay out in terms of the details of your life? So I think we're going to continue to see the strength of Christian denominations with rigor, but there's going to be a lot of them, and they're going to be diverse in terms of, and they're also going to keep nagging at each other. And we're going to continue to see sort of new age pick and match religions. But the difficulty with a lot of them is that it's hard to sustain because you don't have a community and you don't have an institution and you don't have a tradition. So it might just be demographic wise that, if you look at the Collinses over at Based Camp, it might just be that demographic wise, the religious will continue to rule the earth because the religious are the only ones who are reproducing in serious numbers. And even if they're kids, it's going to be very interesting 20 years from now, if I live long enough to see it, what the next generation of, look like someone like Richard Roll, and he's a friend of Jonathan Pajot's. I've done a bunch of videos with him. He was raised sort of Gothard, homeschooled, fundamentalist, bunker Christianity, leaves that, goes to Orthodoxy, now has become a priest, raising his kids within Orthodoxy, homeschooling. So it's sort of like, well, you were homeschooled, you're homeschooling your kids. It used to be that you were, anxious about Catholics and idolatry and communism and, Halloween. Now you sort of have room for Halloween and mythology and icons. What are your kids going to do? I have no idea. And of course, the vision is our kids are going to be more Orthodox than we are because we're going to raise them in that. But based on what we've seen for the last number of generations, I don't know. Some
liberal
of them will
Baptists? Be. Yeah. Who knows? It is a really interesting thing. I mean, it seems that there's a lot of ways of looking at it. Obviously, you have like a theological lens, sociological lens, kind of psychological lens, and many more. At least one part of like growing up seems to be differentiation from your parents and finding part of your identity in I am not them. And I think we see that sometimes with religion, even when people don't leave the big umbrella of their parents' religion, like, they're still Christians. They often are part of like maturing in their faith and kind of making their faith their own, to use that language, is kind of finding a new expression that feels different, that feels unique to them and allows them to go further up and further in, to use Lewis's language. And I think That's not something that really bothers me at all. And I'll often get people asking me questions. Like I get comments all the time of, hey, I watch your videos and your videos help me become Catholic. Your videos help me become Orthodox. Your videos, what have you. And I am not Catholic or Orthodox. And people are like, does that bother you? And maybe this makes me seem like too much of a pluralist or downplaying theology, which I think theology is really important. But I think a lot of the time, at least part of what's going on there is people are taking ownership of their faith and they're trying to find an expression where they can go deeper into it. And insofar as that's what's happening, I'm always like, no, that doesn't bother me. I don't lose any sleep over that. Good for them. They seem to be really thriving and more passionate about their faith than before. And so that's a win. But I will say, I remember talking to friends. I did my undergrad at Moody Bible Institute. So, a lot of kids from Christian homes. And it was their parents grew up in the Mainline, and so then they went to these evangelical churches because, wow, church can be cool now. We've got electric guitars. And then all their kids were becoming Anglican, or all their kids were becoming Orthodox. And it will be interesting to see what happens, as you say, from there. Will it just continue to be this generational flip-flop? Probably in some cases. And then you'll have other people who are, the fifth generation Baptist pastor or the fifth generation Orthodox or whatever. But it does seem like this has been part of what goes on, especially since we've had increasing religious choice, and your belonging in a community more generally, in the civic community, isn't tied to your religious denomination. But it'll be fascinating to see what happens, and I think we'll all, Lord willing, we'll get to see some of it.
Well, I think this is part of the American story. So if you look at, let's say, rates of observance of white Brits in England in the established Church of England, super low. And right now there's a lot of people who are just gaga over orthodoxy. But you look at rates of observance in Orthodox churches in traditionally Orthodox country, often very low. Come to America, and suddenly it's this vibrant religious marketplace. I mean, de Tocqueville wrote about that, a very long time ago. So I just did a video with a bunch of Christian Reformed people, most of them boomers, a lot of them older than myself. And a part of what happened in the Christian Reformed Church over the last 3 years was we had a couple of churches decide that they were going to go openly affirming, or at least open, and Synod basically said no, and the churches were like, well, let's see if Synod does anything. And Synod did. But the Christian Reformed Church has been mostly run by boomers for a very long time. And all of the boomers had expectations that, well, we're just going to keep getting more and more progressive. And so we allowed women in church office in the 90s. And so now we'll, embrace same-sex marriage now in the 2020s. And that's sort of the trajectory of the future. But a bunch of us were like, you don't have the votes. Because many of the children of these boomers, they're no longer in Christian Reformed churches. Some are not going to any church. Some are going to other churches. And a lot of the people who are clergy, a lot of the young clergy come out of the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement who came into the Christian Reformed Church, many of them not white. So you had all of these white boomers talking about, we really need to be listening to the voices of people of color. And then when you actually have people of color on the Senate floor saying, no, we're not going to have this same-sex marriage there, they're like, they're just like, I don't know how to process what happened. The future was not like I imagined it as a boomer. And, well, the future is a very strange place, and we never quite know what we're seem to be backing into. So, but that's just been the little Christian Reformed Church when everyone expected, the Reformed Church of America, which is sort of the denomination our church came out of, 170 years ago. Their structure was that they couldn't discipline the East Coast churches that were having rainbow flags, and the denomination lost 3/4 of its membership in 3 years. Huh. And so, these things are happening. But then again, I just did a conversation with another graduate of Moody Bible Institute, C.W. Weeks. I don't know when he graduated, but he made the argument that, are all these ecclesiastical containers really just sort of parachurches? And part of why I look at that is because you and your YouTube channel probably have more influence than what denomination did you grow up in?
I grew up in a non-denominational church, which is like pretty much a Baptist church that didn't go through the trouble of belonging to
Okay.
the.
So
But
you probably have more influence in American or even global Christianity than 99% of non-denominational local church pastors.
Yeah, Lord have
And the
mercy.
same for the Catholics and the Orthodox. Now, I'm a member of the clergy. So in a sense, so I just made a video, basically said, you look at the Catholic channels and the Orthodox channels, who's forming American Orthodoxy more? Jonathan Peugeot or rando priest in some little Orthodox church in some place? And what does that mean in terms of ecclesiology?
It is intriguing because, I mean, in most cases, unlike your pastor, you have Jonathan Peugeot in your pocket, and you can listen to. He's made enough content that you could listen to him 8 hours a day while you sit at your desk all day, or whatever you do. As you're working a crane or what have you. And yeah, the level of influence is just so different. Which I take your point. I think where you're going is that it does kind of upend the relative authority of the church in your life, or at least of the clergy in your life.
It does. It's helpful, and you and I both know just a segment of American Christianity pays any attention to YouTube. Because we do know that, massive amounts of Christians have no idea what's happening on YouTube. And even this Orthodox moment, statistically, is very small. The Orthodox churches are losing people because of immigrants and their children deconstructing faster than they're gaining orthobros via Peugeot, Peterson, or the internet.
Yeah, YouTube Christianity is very self-selecting, right? Like when you look at YouTube Christianity, it seems that everyone is, very theological and very interested in traditional Christianity, and generally speaking, pretty like rigorous, conservative, etc. But what I think we fail to recognize are like which people are spending their free time watching videos about Christianity. Like it's a certain segment of that population. And we also can often forget that YouTube's really good at showing people who are showing us videos that are just like us. I always go back to a comment I remember receiving one day. It was this older woman who said, "I think a revival is breaking out in America because every video I see on YouTube is about Christianity." And I was like, do you burst that bubble? Like, because when you get off the internet, take a walk down the street, that's probably not what you're going to see. And it's remarkable how we're shown what's interesting to us, and then also, that kind of self-selection feature there.
Yeah, my father, I'm a third generation minister, and my father had a church in Paterson, New Jersey, in a mostly African-American neighborhood. And I remember when I was listening to the news one day, and I heard a statistic that African-Americans were 10% of the American population. And I was like, what? Because, everyone around me is black. And the black people live all close together, and you get out where the white people are, they're all apart. So there's got to be way, way more black people than white people. And it's just this bias of this sample of that's absolutely hilarious. Yeah, you don't want to say, there's this thing called the algorithm, and the more you watch something, the more they'll feed it to you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and I mean, we talked about a little bit about concerning things. I do think it doesn't often help us to have the kind of curious, open-minded dialogues that we might want to have, because all we see are people who reinforce the ideas that we already have, which serve to kind of cement this sneaking suspicion that a lot of us carry around, that the people who disagree with us are probably stupid. Like, we might not say that out loud, but I think a lot of people, we walk around with this sneaking suspicion that the thoughts the opinions I hold are just so blatantly self-evident that whoever doesn't hold these, like, they must just be like ignorant of the topic entirely, or just like thoroughly obtuse, or maybe willfully bad. And of course, maybe of course might be too strong, but I don't think that's actually the case. Like, I think a lot of these things are just really complicated, and we have our own intuitions that are bumping up against our own experiences that cause us to see the world in certain ways and interpret the same evidence in very, radically different directions. But that takes time, and that, takes a certain self-awareness. And it's much easier when everyone you see, every video you see is like, Catholic owns Protestant, or, woke teen gets owned by, trad so-and-so, or the inverse of all of these. You begin to think like, yeah, the people who disagree with me, they're probably not very intelligent.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you're also like me, being really stupid, because if you really want to be successful on YouTube religion, it's concern trolling and fear baiting and boundary policing and owning, and that's the way to success on religious YouTube. So if you're going to talk about nuance, if you're going to be a squish, sorry, you're probably never going to get that nice little silver plaque to put behind you that says, I hit 100,000 subs. So
it always cracks me up a little bit on a couple of levels when I get a lot of comments from people telling me that the reason I haven't become Catholic or Orthodox is because of the money, because there's this great financial incentive to, kind of be this person who kind of stands in the middle and kind of hosts people from different directions. And the first thing that always cracks me up about that is like, I don't know what kind of YouTube economics you're going off of, but like, we're not making Mr. Beast money out here. Like, I'll show you my ad revenue. It is nothing. It's not nothing. I'm grateful for it, and I'm grateful for the people that give through Patreon. There's a reason I work full time though, right? Like, we're not getting rich off this. And the second thing that always cracks me up is like, I would almost guarantee I could at least triple, quadruple my YouTube income if I decided tomorrow I'm going to be a trad Catholic, Orthodox, whatever, and I will only make videos about how right I am and how wrong everyone else is, because that's what people give to. Like, and that's the thing that inspires people, because you're on my team, and I know what winning looks like. I know what the stakes are. Like, if we don't win this war against the people who are wrong, then everything's going to go terribly, and we know who the enemy is. Like, that motivates people, right? There's a reason you have this kind of, there's a reason Dr. Seuss was doing propaganda in the wars. Okay? Like, this is how you inspire people to act. So it's always funny to me. But that aside of people's, thoughts of why I do things, it really is the case that, algorithms don't generally favor nuance. But hopefully, we can find the algorithms are good enough to find the people that do value those kinds of things, I suppose.
Yeah. And so for me, what's been a joy in my time on YouTube has been make friends. And having, I got into this because in my own networks, I wasn't having the kinds of conversations I wanted to have. And basically what I built on YouTube was a network of people so I could have the kinds of conversations I wanted to have. And kind of what we've all built together is so a bunch of us could have the kinds of conversations we wanted to have. And I remember back when long distance was very expensive. So, YouTube just kind of, and, if your channel is big enough, hey, you can hopefully at least, pay for itself, or even pay for a little bit of your time. That's cool. So that's why I do it. And, but YouTube's been very, very good to me. So I don't have a private jet, but I do get a chance to do more of what I really want to do. And it's cool.
And I'm so glad for that. And that's a beautiful thing about YouTube. And I would totally echo that sentiment of my favorite thing about making videos are the relationships that have come out of it. And especially when I've gotten to meet some of these people in person. And I love that you're doing real in-person communities and events, because that does really take it to another level. Whether it's I meet someone who watches my videos and we chat, but especially if it's someone like this, where we have a lovely conversation online, and then we get to actually go grab dinner or something like that. And the thing I've gotten to do a couple in-person conversations for the channel, and it is so fun. Like, I mean, it's wonderful. And being able to hopefully do more of those, when I set those up, I'm like, if I can not lose money on this, I'll call this a success. Like, I can fly someone out and, I don't have to explain to my wife why why the budget looks different this month. We'll call it good. But yeah, the opportunity to have the conversations that we'd love to have. I often say about it, like, I would do these conversations if no one watched them. It helps incentivize people to talk to me because people watch them. But all the rest of it's kind of the icing on the cake.
Yeah. And that's sort of what has developed in Big T, Big C, this little corner, because most of our channels in our little flotilla most of them are less than 1,000. Some of them have gotten up over 1,000, but most of them are less than 1,000. And most of the time when we do a live stream, there's between 5 and 20 people who are watching it. But everybody's gotten to know each other, and they have, they're talking to each other in the live chat. And that's, what I've seen is that for a lot of people, it's really filled a niche for them. It's some of the people already are involved in a church community, but there isn't a lot of appetite or space in that church community to have these kinds of conversations. So they have room in their life to do both. And then the broader networks that the internet facilitates then just helps you connect with even more interesting people. And so, yeah, we had an event in the fall in Olympia, Washington. We're going to have some events in Europe around my trip out there. We're going to have a major event in Chicago in the middle of August, and we're going to have John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot and Elizabeth Oldfield and Rod Dreher, and we'll probably have 300-400 people there. But we try to do like both small events and big events, and so it's been great fun. It's been great fun, and because you're talking to me, chances are, and we really didn't go into your past, and because you dropped Moody Bible, there's a couple of people that are gonna, they went to Moody Bible too, so you're gonna get some emails and some invitations to go on channels and tell your story and make new friends. So,
and that's the joy of it. And I'm always open to a round two to discuss more things. But we've covered so much ground. This has been an absolute joy today, Paul. Thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And keep doing what you're doing.
Absolutely. Likewise. Well, thank you so much. I think we found a good landing spot. I'll be sure to link to your stuff and what we can figure out all the details here afterwards. But thanks again.
All right. Thank you.